Acts chapter 2 verse 1 says, when the days of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. In the Old Testament, God commanded the Israelites to observe 3 festivals every year. Every man, adult, show themselves before the Lord in the temple 3 times a year. That's 3 festivals of feast. They are Passover in the spring and Pentecost from the 50th day from the first Sabbath after Passover, and the last one is Tabernacles. So those are 3 feasts or festivals that God required all the Israelites to show themselves before the Lord. So it spent also 15th day from the day of Jesus' resurrection. So 50 means Pente, and so it is called Pentecost. The disciples of Jesus remained in Jerusalem following their master Jesus' command to wait for the promise of God to come. And according to Acts chapter 1 verse 5, it is said, I didn't put it up, sorry. Let me read it to you. 1:13, yeah, that's right. It says, when they had entered, and they went up into the upper room where they were staying. So they got the command in verse 5, and after the ascension of Jesus, they come together, they entered the house and went up into the upper room, which is probably belonged to John Mark. So, they gathered together in the upper room, probably around 20 to 30. To 11 disciples and 6 brothers and sisters of Jesus and his mother and other women. So altogether probably 20 to 30. That's a good size for the upper room. However, in verse 15, it says, and in those days Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples. Altogether the number of names was about 120, and said, and there was another meeting. Few days later probably, and there were how many people there? 120. You know how many people can be here in this sanctuary? Do you know? Can you guess? This sanctuary can hold? Yeah, Sonny? Yeah, around 100. Okay. If we sit in the pews, we may have up to 120 or up to 150. So to hold that many people, the building must be this size. But I don't believe, that's the size of the upper room. That's 2 upper rooms, probably smaller. That could not hold that many people at a time. So probably it's somewhere else. I guess they gather somewhere else, and the best candidate place for that size group of people must be the temple complex. In verse 2, it says, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it is filled with the whole house where they were sitting. So it says they were sitting in a house, right? It says the whole house. The wind filled the whole house where they were sitting. It looks like a house, but in Greek, the house is oikos. Now, oikos in the Bible translated as family, home, house, lineage of house, church even, and family, and house as a property. And also it is translated as temple. Oikos, the Greek word, is translated as temple. So Luke chapter 11:51, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple here in Greek is oikos. So the temple, Acts in chapter 2 verse 2, the house could be the temple of Jerusalem, not the upper room of Mark. That's what I believe. Then where they gathered in the temple? Let me show you the drawing of the temple at the time. That's the temple built by the King Herod. It's a giant complex. This is called temple complex. Probably they gathered together in this section, Solomon's portico. This is one side is open with columns around it, and so it has a roof over their head. How big is the temple? Look at this. This is the football field size. Okay, and this is the temple complex size. So the temple complex is about 10 times bigger than football field. Very, very big. It can hold up to 100,000 people at a time. Very big size building. So probably 120 people gathered under the roof of Solomon's portico. And what happened when they were sitting there? Probably they were sitting and praying. They come together because it was prayer time, 9 o'clock in the morning. Acts chapter 2:15 says, "For these are not drunk as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day," which means 9 o'clock in the morning. They came together 9 o'clock in the morning because Jews prayed 3 times a day, 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. And what happened when they gathered together for prayer? Let's go back to verse 2. It says, "And suddenly there came a sound from heaven, as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled with the whole house where they were sitting." They heard sound of wind. Anybody heard the sound of winds blowing? Okay, hopefully I have it. This is the sound of winds. It's a tornado sound. So probably they heard this kind of sound all of a sudden, but nothing happened in the sky. So they were astonished, surprised. What is there? What's happening? But not just sound, and they saw something in verse 3. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each one of them. They saw flames of fire coming down, and then each flame setting upon the 120 disciples. Can you imagine? Each person, 120, on their head, there was a flame of fire like a tongue. Looks like a tongue, but it's fire flame. What does flames of the fire signify in the Bible? It signifies the presence of God. The Holy Spirit came down as fire upon the 120 disciples of Jesus, each one of them. And then what happened? In verse 4, it says, "And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance." Here, the Greek word for tongues is glossa. Now, all the time in the Bible, glossa basically means tongue, your tongue physically or language. So in the Bible, the tongue means intelligible foreign languages. It's not babbling of meaningless sounds. I will talk about it later. Let's go on. And it says, Acts chapter 2 verse 5 says, that's 2:5, "And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven." At the time of Pentecost, a lot of people from all over the world, every nation under heaven, came to observe the Feast of Pentecost. According to Timothy Johnson, New Testament professor at Emory University, the Jewish population at the time was about 7 million in the world. 2 million living in Palestine, and 5 million throughout the diaspora, throughout the world, Roman empires. So some Jews and God-fearing Gentiles came to Jerusalem to settle down, to spend their retirement. When they came to the temple to pray at 9 o'clock a.m., they witnessed a strange phenomenon that they never saw before. They heard gushing sound of the winds and saw the flames of fire coming down on a group of people, who then instantly began speaking foreign languages. In verse 6, it says, "And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused, because everyone heard them speak in his own language." They got puzzled. Why? Because they heard the language. How many languages? Verse 7 through 11. Then they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, "Look at all these who speak Galileans, and how it is that we hear, each in our own language in which we were born, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya, adjoining Syrians, visitors from Rome, and both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking in our own tongues, in our own language, the wonderful works of God." These are the maps. They are from all over the world, around the Mediterranean Sea, even up to Turkey area. Parthian and Media, all the colored maps, the origins of the people, and present at the time. So they were puzzled, not because they heard their own language being spoken in Jerusalem, far away from home, but because it was the Galileans who spoke their language. They heard the Galileans speaking their language. And at the time, being Galileans stands for being ignorant and impetuous. They were not educated people. But somehow they were speaking their own language. And some of them who were born and raised in Judea and ignorantly said this in verse 13. When they heard, that's verse 13. Verse 12, yeah. So they were all amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "Whatever could this mean?" And in verse 13, they were perplexed. They didn't know what's happening. And others mocking said they are full of new wine, which means they were drunken and they looked like drunk and doing something weird out of their drunkenness. So let's talk about speaking in tongues, which is the subject of today's sermon. From the context, let's think about the first one. The speaking in tongues means speaking in languages. That's the first point. Acts chapter 2 verse 6 says, "And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused, because everyone heard them speak." Heard the Galileans speak, the disciples of Jesus speak in his own language. And also in verse 8 says, "And how it is that we hear, each in our own language in which we were born." So, speaking in a tongue means speaking a language with grammar and words. It's not babbling of meaningless sounds. That's not the tongue, speaking tongue in spirit. And secondly, speaking in tongues is just one of the proofs receiving the Holy Spirit or being filled with the Holy Spirit. In chapter 2 verse 4, "And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance." Being filled with the Spirit, for the first time in chapter 2 of Acts, the disciple began speaking in tongues. But speaking in tongues is not only proof of being filled with the Spirit. Acts chapter 8 verse 39 says, "Now when they came out of the water, they are the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. The Spirit of the Lord called Philip away, so that the eunuch saw him no more, and he, Enoch, went on his way, rejoicing. So rejoice is another sign of being filled with the Holy Spirit. And also, there are various gifts of the Holy Spirit according to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 8 to 10. These are the gifts from the Spirit. When you fill up the Spirit, receive the Spirit, you will have the word of wisdom, the word of knowledge and faith, gifts of healing and working miracles, prophecy, discerning spirits and tongues, and interpretation of tongues. And also Romans chapter 12, verse 6 through 8 says prophecy, ministry, teaching, exhortation, giving, and leading, and showing mercy are another gifts of the Holy Spirit. You will have those spiritual gifts when you are filled with the Spirit, when you receive the Holy Spirit. So, speaking in a tongue, is not the only proof that you have the Holy Spirit. You receive the Holy Spirit. But speaking in a tongue is the most frequent gift of the Spirit in Acts. So Acts chapter 10, verse 46 says, "For they heard them, Cornelius and his household, speak with tongues and magnify God." And Acts 19:6, "And when Paul had laid hands on them, on the disciples in Ephesus, the Holy Spirit came upon them, and they spoke with tongues and prophesied." So in Acts chapter 2, 20 disciples were all speaking in tongues. But what was the content? Acts chapter 2:11 says, "We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God." So, they knew, the disciples of Jesus, speaking something nice about God, praising God. They did speaking tongues in Acts most. All the disciples, and when all the disciples, when they received the Holy Spirit, all of them spoke in a tongue, even though there were various gifts of the Holy Spirit. Why the tongue is the most appeared gifts in the Acts? I believe it is because speaking in a tongue is the only gift that demonstrates the outpouring of the Spirit instantly on spot. All other gifts need time and other things to be shown, right? To heal somebody, you need sick people, right? If somebody says prophecy, it needs to be proven by somebody else. However, speaking in a tongue doesn't need anything but your mouth. So it shows that you receive the Holy Spirit when you speak in a tongue. Instantly, it shows that you have the Spirit. That's why in the book of the Acts, the speaking tongue appears most of the time over other gifts of the Spirit. And thirdly, there are different kinds of speaking in tongue. Different kinds of tongues. Acts chapter 2:4 says, "And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance." The Greek word for gave is didomi. In the Bible, the Greek Bible, didomi is used as basically as a verb give or gave or deliver or ill, show, showed, make, makes, pay, puts, granting. That way, here, the didomi means basically gave. So the Spirit gave them tongue, enabled them to speak in a tongue. There are three sources of speaking in a tongues: the Holy Spirit first, Satan second, and ourselves. Both the Holy Spirit and Satan can make us speak in a tongue, in a foreign language, fluently and instantly. So Satan can give us a tongue, just like the Holy Spirit does. And also, somebody can teach you how to speak in a tongue. Some pastors teach people to repeat banana backwards repeatedly until your tongue gets screwed up and begin babbling. But that's a self-origin tongue, not the biblical tongue, which will not harm anybody. Then how can we discern tongues from the Spirit and tongues from Satan? By contents of what you speak in a tongue. So Acts chapter 2:11, again, we hear them speaking in our own tongues, wonderful works of God. So when Holy Spirit lets you speak in a tongue, you speak about God, wonderful things. But when Satan gives you a tongue, you will speak against God in a foreign language. That's the difference. That's how we discern. But the problem is that the tongue is a foreign language. Without the gifts of the interpretation, you will not know whether the person is praising God or praising Satan. That's the problem we have. Anyway, let's move on to the last point. Speaking in tongues lets you experience ecstasy. Acts chapter 2:13 says, others mocking said, some people do not understand what they are saying because probably they were born in Jerusalem. They do not know any foreign languages, so they could not make it, a sense out of what they are saying. So they just mocking them. Said they are full of new wine. They were drunken. When you're full of wine, you are experiencing ecstasy, right? Just like that, when the disciples erupted in speaking in tongues, they looked as if drunken. Yeah, they were drunken in ecstasy, in spirit, in the Holy Spirit. Speaking in tongues helps us go deep in the fellowship with God. And one of the God's purpose giving us the gift is for a deeper fellowship with Him. People can pray much longer while speaking in tongue. You can spend the whole night in prayer easily in tongues. Not just tongues. If you are full of the Holy Spirit, filled with the Holy Spirit, you can spend the whole hour in prayer without any difficulty. But you must remember that the ecstasy will only build you up, your fellowship with God, not your church. So the Holy Spirit gives us His gifts to the profit of all, to church, according to 1 Corinthians 12:7. But the manifestation of the gift is given to each one for the profit of all. So all the gifts, except the tongue, is for the profit of the church. And Paul says, also 1 Corinthians 14 verse 4, he who speaks in a tongue edifies himself. So speaking in a tongue edifies just yourself. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 14 and 15, For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful. What is the conclusion then? I will pray with the spirit, and I will also pray with the understanding. I will sing with the spirit, and I will also sing with understanding. So praying in a tongue basically helps us, our spirit, communicate with the Spirit of God clearly and well and deeper. So we can have very intimate and intensive fellowship with God through speaking in a tongue. In that way, speaking in a tongue edifies our faith in God. After receiving the Holy Spirit, Jesus exercised all the gifts of the Spirit, except speaking in a tongue, because He had no problem in communicating with His Father in prayer. So He had a perfect communication, perfect relationship, perfect fellowship with God, and He didn't need the gift of speaking in a tongue. So probably He didn't speak in a tongue. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 18, Paul confessed, I thank my God I speak with tongues more than you all. He received 39 strips 5 times. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was stoned once. He had 3 shipwrecks. he experienced perils of waters, perils of robbers, perils of his own countrymen, perils of the Gentiles, perils in the city, perils in the wilderness, perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren. He was often in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness, in hunger and thirst, in forced fastings, in cold and nakedness. However, he could endure all those things, sufferings and hardships, because he could speak with tongues more than anybody else. He could have fellowship with the Lord, deeper and longer. He was strengthened when he was speaking in a tongue in his prayer. So speaking in a tongue lets you experience ecstasy, which will deepen your relationship with your Lord, your Father, and make you rejoice under unspeakable hardships of your life as strangers in this world. That's why I desire to have that gift. I also ask you to have that desire.